Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I continue my quest to catch up before the decade is over. Yeah, I know we just started this decade. Maybe it could be the decade I'm in the middle of, which, you know, that's another 4.5 years before I hit another decade. But that, I don't know. I don't know which is more realistic, 4.5 years or 9.5 years. Either way, I continue my quest to catch up, and that quest it's going. I can't say if it's going well, but it is at least going. It hasn't stalled, but I don't know if I feel any better about catching up than I did for the last episode. Anywho, I am very happy to bring you this week's author interview. I am speaking with Suzanne Park, who not only has one novel coming out this year, but two. And the first one is her debut novel. So she has her debut novel and then her sophomore novel, I guess you could say, coming out in the same year, which is very exciting. And especially in 2020, which has been a little bit of a weird year. She has these two books coming out relatively close to one another, and we are going to talk about both of those books. The first one that we talk about is a young adult book, and it is called The Perfect Escape. The two main characters in this book are teenagers. They are high school students, and they both work in an escape room. They are the staff and the actors who work in this environment. Have you ever done an escape room? I have not. I know some people who have, but I have never actually done an escape room, and it sounds really interesting. This particular escape room involves zombies. So one of the characters is kind of the not exactly tour guide, but the person who leads the group into the escape room and gives them the rules, etc. And then another character is one of the zombies, which is very fun. I think I would kind of like to be one of the zombies, although she does have to sit in a closet for a lot of her evening, and maybe that wouldn't be so much fun. But, you know, then getting to jump out and be a zombie could potentially be a lot of fun, especially if you had a particularly nervous group that was scared of your zombie self. Let's get the description of the book that is not just my rambling about zombies, but the actual description of the book. So, Nate J. Woo Kim wants to be rich. One of his classmates offers Nate a ridiculous amount of money to commit grade fraud. He knows that taking the windfall will help support his prideful Korean family, but is compromising his integrity worth it? Luck comes in the form of Kate Anderson, Nate's colleague at the zombie-themed escape room where he works. She approaches Nate with a plan. A local tech company is hosting a weekend-long survivalist competition with a huge cash prize. It could solve all of Nate's problems, and she needs the money too. If the two of them team up, Nate has a real shot of winning the grand prize. But the real challenge? Making it through the weekend with his heart intact. So there you go. You've got not only the escape room, but then you have this survival challenge. So there's more than, of course, what I was just telling you about with the zombies. That's just where they meet, and then they come up with this plan. Of course, there always has to be, you know, some kind of plan that brings them together more, and they are, you know, different in a lot of ways. Nate is Korean. Kate has her own, I was going to say her own secrets. She does have her own secrets, but I don't want to make that sound like Nate is Korean and that's his secret. Kate has her own secrets. That's not what I meant. I apologize for how that sentence came out. But Kate comes from a different kind of family with its own issues, and Nate has his own familial issues with his parents and different sorts of pressure that are put on him. I like that this is young adult. It has a lot of comedic elements in it, but then also addresses some of those classic angsty teenage issues. It is, your awkward teenage crush. It's got elements of that. It is multicultural, and I appreciate that. Multicultural also in that it has an interracial relationship between Nate and Kate. Also, yes, their names are Nate and Kate, which is just fun to say. So that's the description of the book. And now let's go ahead. We're going to start with talking about that one, and then we'll move on to the second novel later in the podcast. So let's turn now to my interview with Suzanne Park about her young adult novel, The Perfect Escape. Hi, Suzanne. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. We are here actually to talk about two books from you. Before we get to the books, though, if you could share a bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you, that would be wonderful.
Sure. No problem. My name is Suzanne Park. I am a Korean-American author, and I was born and raised in Tennessee. And then my journey toward being an author, I had a nice windy path to get there. So, but for about 10 years, I was a stand-up comedian and performed in New York and Los Angeles and Seattle, and eventually transitioned into humor fiction writing, which was a better fit for me lifestyle-wise, and my natural inclination is to be a hermit. So this suits my lifestyle a lot better. And 2020 is my debut year, so I have two books in 2020. One released in April, and it's a young adult romantic comedy, and in August 18th, which is soon, I have an adult workplace comedy coming out called Loathe at First Sight.
Yeah, and I think that having your debut year as an author being 2020 sounds like a stand-up routine.
There's just a lot of comedy there. I will one day write a book about this.
Yes,
an author who has to debut two books during a pandemic, back to back.
Yes.
Yes, it might be part horror, part comedy. Who knows?
Like this year, who know? You never know what's going to come next.
Yeah.
So let's start with the young adult novel, The Perfect Escape, since that one came out in April. Can you give an overview of the story, please?
Sure. It's The Perfect Escape is a young adult romantic comedy, and it's about a Korean-American teenager. His name is Nate Kim, and he meets his dream girl at a zombie escape room where they both work. And they both discover that they both need money desperately, so they decide to enter a survivalist competition with a huge cash prize. So two teenagers for an entire weekend surviving the elements in the wilderness. What could possibly go wrong? So that is that book, and that came out in April from Sourcebooks Fire.
So what was your initial inspiration for that story? I mean, it's kind of funny because it's sort of about zombies, but it's not really about zombies. And they do a survivalist trek, but it's not, a weekend, but thankfully there are no zombies.
Yes. The book came about with a convergence of several different things happening around the same time. So a few years ago, my sister wanted to do a zombie escape room. And so my brother, sister, and I participated, and it was probably the funniest thing I've done in a long time is that, we're paired with these people that really were intoxicated, and I don't even know if they really wanted to be there, but we were paired with them, and to be able to kind of move on to the next level, you have to solve these clues as a team. And we were not a very good team. The host actually noted that we were the worst participants he had ever seen come through those doors. And we didn't even solve a single puzzle. Like we kept not understanding clues, and nobody was communicating. It was a disaster, if you will. And as soon as the bell buzzer, whatever, rang, zombies came out and we were eaten. So not the best showing, but it did inspire me to think, there's this host here and he's being super patient, and this is probably the unsexiest place, I don't know if that's a word, but probably the most non-romantic place to have a romantic comedy. Why not place it in a zombie escape room? So two people can meet there and see what happens. So that was part of it. And then around the same time, I've always been a Walking Dead fan and had seen every episode and caught up, and was watching, World War Z and Train to Busan, all these zombie flicks. And then, around that time, I was also kind of obsessed with what would I do if this were me in a zombie apocalypse. So I started buying all these survivalist guides just just so I was, in case it happened, maybe it was important to research. So I became quite the armchair expert on all things survival. And between that zombie escape room experience and also having done all this survivalist research, that book kind of just came together as a puzzle. And I realized I really want to write a book about both of those things.
Well, I was enjoying the two characters, Nate and Kate, which is funny, first of all, but they're meet cute because Kate just kind of stumbles out of a closet where she's been hiding because she's supposed to come out at the grand finale, which they never got to in the escape room. And I was just loving the fact that this young man was instantly attracted to Kate, who is in full zombie regalia.
Yes. Somehow he just is, attracted to her. And, they're kind of these nerdy teenagers who have one thing in common, and it is their love for zombies. And so he's finally met this girl who, as you said, stumbled out of the closet and is one of the zombie actresses. And he's smitten to some degree because there's now this girl who has this, the same type of things that he likes, and that is zombies.
Yeah. Yes. So let's talk a bit more about the two main characters. What about them do you think will resonate with readers?
With Nate, he and Kate, both their stories, I wanted to talk about not only racism to some degree, but also classism and microaggressions and things like that. So when I wrote these two characters, I did want them to be from different worlds. And Nate is from his parents are immigrants. He's a scholarship kid at a local private school, and he already feels sort of othered at that school. And then he meets Kate, who actually is very well off, but in her own way, she also feels alone, and because her mother has passed away, but also she just doesn't feel comfortable with all this wealth either. So between their very different backgrounds, I think that people will find that type of situation where, whatever your economic situation is, you could probably relate to one of these two characters in that you just don't feel like you are comfortable with whatever your financial situation is. Nate is also a very hard worker and really is into a lot of things that are very nerdy as well. And he's kind of goofy, and I really wanted to write a character. It was very important to me to find, to make sure that I wrote a character that wasn't stereotypically, the type of Asian American characters that you see in movies and from, earlier when I used to watch movies and read books from earlier generations. I think that I wanted to depart from that and show a kid that is just trying to, get through life, and just like any other person, any other teenager.
Yeah, and I liked that about Nate. Well, I mean both characters, because they're just teenagers. They have, of course, their own circumstances and their own family situations, et cetera. But, you know, you get the character of Nate, who is Korean American, so you get that representation, but it's not like, oh, this character is Korean American and we must only focus on that. You know, like it's just part of his character. It's just part of who he is, like real life, where people are just who they are, and it affects them in certain ways, and in other ways they're just regular people. Oh my gosh, imagine that.
Exactly. I think with Nate, he identifies as Korean American, and his the family expectations and pressures of being a child of immigrants, in addition to just trying to he really wants to get out of the situation he is, because his parents are always looking for they're happy with their life, but Nate thinks that he wants to make a lot of money. And part of his journey is to realize that money doesn't buy you everything, and it isn't the end-all be-all. And he learns that throughout the course of the book, especially showing Kate, who has everything monetarily, but is clearly missing something emotionally.
I'm going to jump in here so we can take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we will be continuing to speak about the young adult novel, The Perfect Escape. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking with author Suzanne Park. Before the break, we were speaking about her young adult novel, The Perfect Escape. We are still going to be speaking about that at the beginning of this segment, but I do want to give you the description of her second book that we'll be speaking of, simply because I don't want to give that to you at the next break when we have already started speaking about it. So, weird little timing issue, but that's okay. Hopefully, I know you guys are smart. You can figure these things out. So her second novel is Loathe at First Sight. This is adult fiction rather than young adult fiction. And Melody Jew is thrilled to land her dream job as a video game producer, but her new position comes with challenges. An insufferable CEO, sexist male coworkers, and an infuriating yet distractingly handsome intern, Nolan Mackenzie, also known as the guy who got hired because his uncle is the boss. Just when Melody thinks she's made the worst career move of her life, her luck changes. While joking with a friend, she creates a mobile game that has male strippers fighting for survival in a post-apocalyptic world. Suddenly, Melanie's joke is her studio's most high-profile project, and Melody's running the show. When Nolan is assigned to Melody's team, she's sure he'll be useless. But as they grow closer, she realizes he's smart and sexy, which makes Melody want to forget he's her intern. As their attraction deepens, she knows it's time to pump the brakes, even with her Korean parents breathing down her neck to hurry up and find a man. With her project about to launch, Melody suddenly faces a slew of complications, including a devastating trolling scandal. Could the man she's falling hard for help her play the game to win, in work and in love? And that is the description of Loathe at First Sight, and we'll be talking about that book in a little bit. But first, back to The Perfect Escape, which we were speaking of before the break. So back to Nate and Kate.
So what kinds of research then did you do for the book?
for that book, besides really looking into a lot of escape room type of different escape rooms, again, watching a lot of movies, reading a lot of books, and the survivalist guides were really coming in handy for writing all of this. The other thing I actually did for this book was because it's a male point of view and multiple, it has a dual point of view, I did go back to some previous young adult fiction that I had read earlier that I thought would be good to see to make sure that I could really understand how to write Nate's voice. And, I went back to some of the earlier John Green, and even all the way back to Catcher in the Rye, just because I had to read that in high school, and I was just curious to know what's changed and what's not. And what I did find out is, teenagers, there's a lot that has changed just because society's changed so much, but also a lot hasn't changed in terms of how teenagers see themselves and how they want to, grow up. And so because that was something that I guess I wasn't really expecting, because some of these books were older and I hadn't read them in a long time. I didn't realize how some of it could be evergreen. And I'm realizing that a lot with some of the literature that I've read from like the 70s and 80s, just to go back and to read some things. Some of the language is really maybe not the best now, but the characters' journeys aren't too different sometimes. So in this particular case, I felt like I needed to prepare myself to write Nate's voice, and I think that researching and going back to these previous works really helped me find what would be important to a teenager today. Plus, I actually have a lot of teenagers in my family, so that was also helpful, just to be around them and hear what they like to do, and what activities they have and how they interact with their friends, because that has changed, and I think that was important to include in this book.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about writing Nate, because presumably you at one point were a teenage girl, so you have that experience, although
yes.
I'm sure this is a little different than teenage girls today, but having never been a teenage boy, writing that voice, getting that voice right, I would imagine that could be a bit of a challenge, or, an interesting experience at least.
For this book, I really try to think also back to guys that I grew up with that were Korean American, and how their journeys could be also a little bit different than probably a typical white American, in the Midwest or the South. I also thought about my brother, who grew up, again, just being somewhat inspired by him as well when I was writing it. One thing that I thought is true to all of my writing is that I like to write about nerdy new love. So, and I think in any case where you have that, because these people are inexperienced or kind of awkward around, around this trying to find true love problem, there's a coming of age element to the story. So whether it's my young adult or my adult books, they do go on their own journey of self-exploration. And in this case, Nate did have that as well, because he wanted to, get all the money, but he also had to weigh that against, how do I handle now having to think about this new element in my life, which is potential love. And I've got Kate here. What do I do with all of this? It's all new to me.
So, basically things that most people go through. How do I deal with all of this? And, oh, look, a new relationship. All right, let's just throw that into the mix.
Yeah.
So
and then your plans don't always go as expected. And in this case,
exactly.
His plan was to make a lot of money by this age, and I know exactly what I want to do because I've wanted this since I was little. And then you have this person who means a lot to him, and then he really just doesn't know how to reconcile all of it because whatever he decides will change his plan.
Right. So let's transition to the second book. This is an adult book. It's called Loathe at First Sight, and give an overview of this story.
Sure. This book is about a Korean American junior video game producer. Her name is Melody Ju, and she is tasked with releasing a controversial video game. And she's antagonized by everyone around her, including the new NBA intern who happens to be the CEO's nephew.
So Nate is a gamer in The Perfect Escape, and Melody is working on a new controversial game, as you said. Are you yourself a gamer?
I was more of a gamer before I became a mother. I think I just had a lot more time on my hands. My husband played games as well, and I think back then we just played more games together. Now, because we have so much going on, that it's now more of a solitary activity. So while maybe, say, 10 years ago, I used to play games and finish them, my favorite one was called Katamari Damacy, where it's basically you start off with a sticky ball, and you use the controllers to roll it around, and it picks up things around a room. So it's like, it picks up a pencil or, Post-it notes or whatever. And then each level, the ball gets bigger, and also the obstacles and challenge gets harder, so that you're actually picking up bigger things. So, then it becomes you're in the neighborhood and you're picking up cars, and final level is you being in this city and you are picking up buildings and skyscrapers, and it's ridiculous, actually. And then I actually finished that game. I take great pride because it's actually hard to finish all the levels of any video game. And the way I knew I won was because they showed the credits at the end. And that was like maybe one of my biggest pastime achievements, I guess, is to actually finish a video game. I haven't done much since, but currently we have a Switch, and I play with my daughter. And so the game that I'm best at is called Arms. It's basically a punching game where you just have these arms that are elastic and they can stretch out, and each character has slightly different talents. And so that's one that I can play with her. And the other thing that I've recently started doing because of the pandemic is this game called Ring Fit Adventure. And that one is you buy this basically like a steering wheel, and you attach the controllers to it. And you go through this adventure as if you're part of the game. So you attach one controller to your leg, and the other one is on the steering wheel, like controller, and you run, you dodge, and you move the steering wheel to turn right and left, and then your leg is what shows you running and jumping. And so it's actually nice. It's a good way to pass time, get exercise. It's also a lot of fun. So that's been the latest thing I've been playing.
Fun. The first game that you described sounds like and I mean this in the nicest possible way, but the nerdiest video game I've ever heard of, and I love that because I'm not a huge gamer, but I love that it's just it's like strategy and picking things up and figuring things out.
Yeah, you have to know it's like the stickiness level to what you've already picked up, and then the funniest thing about the whole thing is you think what is the strategy here? But if you pick up something that is too big at the wrong time, it makes your ball lopsided or hard to steer, and you can't really roll it. So, imagine like a ball of dough, and then you having like a big thing attached to it. You can't really roll it as a ball. So it's the same idea, and it's a very hilarious game, and it actually has a very good soundtrack as well. So I also enjoyed listening to it as you're playing. So I think, and they have different iterations of the game since I was playing on the PlayStation 2, but my niece plays a version of it. I don't know on which console, but she loves it. But it's like a later version.
Mhm. Fun. Okay, so back to the book. So, Melody is the main character here. What was then your inspiration for this particular story?
I've been researching this book for 4 years, and back in 2016, I visited a friend at a large game studio here in California, and I wanted to know kind of the behind the scenes of a game company because I had always wanted to write a book about somebody in the gaming industry. Didn't really have an idea of what I wanted, and it seemed at the time very glamorous from the outside, because I had played games and, I was working in technology and gaming felt tech adjacent. So I got a tour of her company, and it was really amazing to see things that I expected, which was, when you first walk in, there's basically a game museum because this company's been in this industry forever. So you see some of their earliest games, you see like statues of their founder, things like that, where you're walking through there, and then you get to the offices. And some of the first things I saw was, these cardboard cutouts of, aliens with blood dripping from their teeth, to women that were holding automatic assault rifle type artillery and wearing chainmail bikinis, and those were just at people's desks. And I just was very overwhelmed by everything I was seeing, because I guess I kind of expected some of it, but I hadn't thought through, what I was really experiencing until way after. When on the drive back, I started reflecting, thinking, well, if I write a book about this, I need to kind of do this justice, because I don't know how, on the outside, if they know anything about this world. If you're not a gamer or play video games, that's one thing. But also, behind the scenes, there's actually, because it's such a male-dominated industry, there's so much to that work experience that would be seen as toxic. So I went in there thinking, again, 4 years ago, I'll just do my best to research this. And I'm a former marketing research person, so this was very important to me to get it right. So I interviewed people in the gaming industry to talk to them, both male and female employees at different companies. I went to a lot of gaming panels at events, and then I also did a lot of reading. So I had tons and tons of online articles, but also read a lot of books about the women in the workplace, to the other ones were about the psychology behind online trolling, to sort of this autobiography about somebody that had worked at a game company and gotten harassed. And so all those things, I was researching it, and I realized pretty quickly that, that type of work experience, working at a game company, especially for a woman of color, it was not necessarily fun and games, and that sexual harassment and racism were, and still is, very pervasive and rampant. So I wanted to make sure that although I was writing a comedy, to make sure that I didn't take away from the seriousness of the situation. So the hard part about this book was to make sure I kept a balance between being true and honest to what was actually going on in the gaming industry, but also providing a humorous angle to it, so that maybe people will be more receptive to hearing the message behind why the industry needs to change.
Yeah, and that was one thing that I liked about Melody's character, was that she is in this male-dominated industry, and actually the way you created the plot of the video game was both funny, but also it was in the context of that sexism. That I don't want to give too much away in the book, but Melody and another female coworker are just joking about this game that they're going to create that's completely sexist in the reverse way. Like, it's just ridiculous. and so, you highlighted that because the guys behind them are talking about boobs and how they should bounce more realistically, and just, yeah. So I appreciated the humor, the highlighting the seriousness in that situation.
Yes, and there really is this thing called jiggle physics.
Of course there is.
Yes. So there's like a science to it, and people take, the artistry very seriously, but that's so in the weeds. And if you actually take a huge step back and look at the types of games that require jiggle physics, you do wonder, who is making these decisions and why, and are they doing enough to change how these characters are in the storylines, and are these narratives inclusive enough so that you actually can, appeal to more gamers.
Time for another quick break. When we come back, Suzanne will be sharing a story that is also in the book about an explanation of sorts as to why the female gaming characters are not wearing that many clothes or as much clothing as they could be wearing. So you definitely want to hear that story. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. As I mentioned before the break, there is a story that Suzanne is about to share. But before she shares her story, I want to share mine. And one of my questions about video games, one of my, annoyances about video games is the music in them. I tend to always turn the music off in whatever kind of game I'm playing, and yet the men in my life, throughout my life, have always tended to listen to that music at hugely loud volumes that are so much more annoying than just listening to them at regular volume. But when I was in college, I went to visit. Okay, this is complicated. I went to visit with my friend, her boyfriend, and his brother. So the brother was playing a video game and listening to it at the top of the volume, as high as the volume would go. And not only was the music annoying, but the scantily clad woman in the video game would kill people and then eat them, I think. At any rate, there was these really disgusting noises that she would make when she was eating them, disposing of them. I remember she was scantily clad, and I remember there were really disgusting noises along with the annoying music. And so I don't know, that may have turned me off of video games forever. I do play some games, but really I'm more of the nerd word game girl. Those are the games that I prefer, but I still turn the music off. Let's go ahead and get back to the interview with Suzanne about her second novel, Loathe at First Sight.
I've never really been a gamer, but I've been around lots of people who are, and I've always sat there thinking, why is she not wearing more clothes? Or why? Yeah. So those are things that I've noticed from not playing, but just watching people play.
One of my friends in the industry sent me this article, and I mentioned this in the book, where there's a guy that actually tries to justify why his one of the female main characters has no clothes on, basically. It's a very skimpy outfit. And his reasoning was that it was something to do with photosynthesis. Like the more sun exposure you have, the more energy she gets and is able to survive. And that was his reasoning. And people kind of just, nodded their heads and like, oh, that makes sense. But from the outside looking in, as you read these things and hear about them and the reasons for making decisions the way they do, it just doesn't make sense, or it's offensive. And that's really how that one was. It was just kind of surprising and offensive to me to hear that was like an actual reason that was, put in, in print, or actually recorded him saying these words as if he really truly believed it.
Right. And from the description in the book of the workplace, it sounds like maybe he could use some photosynthesis because, it sounds like they work in a very dark environment. Maybe this man needs some vitamin D therapy.
It's true. It is very true. Well, one thing that you did mention, that you're not a gamer, but there are themes in this book and characters and scenes that are relatable to even people outside of the gaming industry. I've heard from early readers who are lawyers and, advertising copywriters and people in higher ed tell me that they can relate to a lot of the scenarios and coworkers that are described in the novel. And, so when somebody takes credit for your idea, or you're assigned a project because somebody else dropped the ball and it should be somebody else's job, so you end up doing twice as much work to make up for that person that's slacking off. Those are all things that are relatable to anybody outside of gaming. And I wanted to make sure that at least people that are reading it that aren't really interested in the video game industry could still relate to it, because I think that, especially for women of color, that always happens to them, where they just get work dumped on them and, it's expected that they do it and not complain.
Yeah, unfortunately, some of those sexist relationships or sexist situations that are depicted in the book can happen pretty much anywhere. So unfortunately, a lot of people will be able to relate to those types of situations. In terms of the romance, because it is a romantic comedy, it's a hate to love story. What draws you to those types of romantic stories?
So this book is a rom-com in sort of the movie sense. And I grew up watching movies from the 90s and early 2000s as kind of slapsticky, funny, goofy rom-coms. And I think that these books that I write, again, that they feature nerds with new love, and that has a huge coming of age element or component to the story. I think that's a lot like how those movies were designed back then, where there's usually a protagonist and they're going through some life changes, and then there's love presented to them, and then at the end there's a happily ever after. So I think of my books as following that sort of storyline. So again, in publishing, what I have written doesn't exactly fall squarely in contemporary romance, and again, it's more like these kind of screwball romantic comedies of the 90s and 2000s. So finding comp titles it's not really, there aren't a lot of them for something that I've written, because it's not kind of your typical rom-com. But I was drawn to it because I think that I like to write nerds who can find true love too. And the reality is there's a lot of stories that have two people that are extremely attractive or are super suave, or there's something that makes them super attracted to the other person, and then by the end of the book they're together. And I think that's just not how my life goes, or any of my friends' lives goes. There's so much awkwardness and stumbling and miscommunication, and most importantly, just these missed opportunities that are almost moments and they don't turn into moments. and then you overthink them and worry, like, did I read that wrong? Just those types of things. And again, I did want to make sure that these nerds could find a happily ever after at the end. It's just not how I think a lot of stories unfold, where things kind of fall into place and it's huge, ball rolling to this big finale. These guys are really constantly, twisting and turning and kind of confused, and they sort of keep missing, they have these missed moments, and then at the end, they finally come together in a perfect way. And that's the type of romances that I wanted to see in a book.
And I, again, with their meeting, with the meeting of the two main characters who have the love interest, I liked it was a nerdy meeting because they're fighting over a cup that is what was it, the chemical element of coffee? What?
Yeah. The coffee cup in question had the chemical elements of what coffee is. So it was a chemistry joke, basically.
Yes, which I love. And you mentioned growing up watching romantic comedies in the 80s and the 90s, and I agree. This is slightly off topic, but I was talking to my niece yesterday, and my niece and my sister, and I quoted When Harry Met Sally to my sister, and my niece was just like, I have to watch this movie. You guys keep quoting it, and I've never seen it. she's 14, and I was like, well, yeah, you got to see it. But
it's true. Yeah, these classics, there's lines and there's moments and scenes that are so memorable that they really have impacted, society, even when they become these quotable, memorable moments. And again, those types of sweet romances where the two people are goofily coming together, I just really wanted to have something like that on page.
I agree. You mentioned that you researched this book for about 4 years. Are there any autobiographical elements within the book, or either book, actually?
For both books, I think I do have. I do talk about the stress of familial expectations. So for both the young adult Nate Kim, he has to kind of figure out how to balance his home life and his school life and try to, excel at both so that he can try to, again, do well financially. And his parents have definitely put pressure on him, with him having a scholarship that is a free ride, but he has to keep a certain GPA, to them, wanting him to go to a good college, things like that I think are true in both books, and then also very kind of relatable from my own upbringing. And then with Melody, she has a tendency to want to do everything herself. That is a big part of her journey, is that she might appear at first stubborn, but really what she wants to do is prove herself. And by doing that, she really just wants to do the work herself so that she can show that she's strong and that she's smart and resourceful at a company and an industry that keeps trying to knock her down, and she's underestimated left and right. So part of the actual title is Loathe at First Sight, which has the enemies to lovers component to it, because it is referring to the key relationship in the story, but also talks about the environment that she's in, where she's surrounded by naysayers who really want to see her fail. And so she realizes as she's at this company that this isn't something she's ever faced before, and that to be able to succeed, she really needs to learn to be part of a team and ask for help and support when she needs it. So she does find support in her coworkers and friends, and is able to get the game out the door on time. And I think the other thing that's great about her journey is that she also wants wants and does work toward creating change in the industry. So most relatable to me about her is just the her wanting to do everything herself and handle it so that you'll know things get done. But when you move up in a company, especially if you get assigned a team or somebody that reports to you, you have to learn to let things go and let them grow into a position so that they have ownership and accountability. And that's actually a very hard thing to learn. And it's not something that they really teach you in any sort of managerial training. And I think that for Melody was hard to do and learn how to do. The other thing that was somewhat autobiographical was Melody's parents in the book. They're basically like almost clones of my parents. So they're, I would say like an 85% match. So I won't tell you what parts are similar and what parts are not, but they definitely, that part was actually very easy to write because, some people have questions, could anybody really say all these things? And they're like, actually, yes. These words that come out of Melody's mouth have either been spoken out loud or something very close to it has been spoken out loud. So that part is very true to my life. But again, I have learned to cope with it through humor. So
right.
Hopefully.
Well, and I think both characters, both Nate and Melody's relationships with their parents and the fact that they are Korean American and the children of immigrants and trying to find their own path, but with their parents' expectations, and there's that definite tension between how they envision their life going and what their parents want for them, et cetera.
Et cetera. At this point being our final break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be wrapping it up with my usual nosy questions that I like to ask all of my authors. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Suzanne Park. We've been talking about the two books that she has coming out or that have come out in 2020. The first is a young adult book called The Perfect Escape. The second is an adult novel called Loathe at First Sight. So let's go ahead and return now to the interview with Suzanne.
You released two books this year, which is impressive. Talk about the differences or similarities in writing these two books. One's young adult, multiple points of view. The other is adult with Melody's own voice. How was that? Did you write them at similar times, or did they get written at different times? What was that process?
So I'm not one to write multiple projects at the same time. I'm very linear in the way I write, and I get distracted. So I actually wrote Loathe at First Sight first. That was a draft I had written a few years ago, and I actually ended up rewriting it. It was originally a very dark workplace comedy, and she was already there wasn't this romantic interest in it. And the reason why I think that I wanted to bring that back and rewrite it was that did feel a little darker and heavier because of the subject matter, but I did know that I wanted to get this book out in the world because I think that this problem, this toxic gaming industry really does need to be looked at and examined closely. And I really felt very passionate about making sure that this message got out there. So I didn't want to shelve it forever. I knew that I wanted to bring it back and rewrite it, but I didn't know how. So in the meantime, that was sitting there, and I'd written Perfect Escape a little bit later on. That one was going to be a book that I wanted to make it a challenge for me. And by doing both dual point of view, which that's the only book I've ever written that way, and the books that I'm currently writing are back to single point of view. I just wanted to try something out of my comfort zone, which was dual point of view, and also write it from a teen boy's perspective, which, as we already discussed, it required a lot more like research and thinking hard about what kind of voice Nate needed to have. So, writing that and then doing the research of older books, plus trying to really understand how teens are, that was sort of all that went into writing that one. For the adult book and that voice, it was a little bit easier for me in that I knew, and I think most of my books going forward will all be about workplace environments and workplace comedies. And because I have a lot of stories from my work experience, or I have talked to a lot of people who have had crazy things happen to them in corporate America. And that actually I haven't seen a lot written about the workplace in contemporary fiction, surprisingly, from a female point of view. So I really wanted to have workplace comedies as being sort of what I will focus on in the future. And it wasn't too bad because, again, I could pull from a huge well of stories from working in technology and at a technology company and in marketing, and I worked in the airline business. And so there's just a lot of things that happen behind closed doors that happen in meetings or poor decision making or whatever it is that I wanted to bring into a novel, because I think these things are relatable, but also can be really humorous and funny.
Thank you for that. So you mentioned, that you've done stand-up comedy, you've worked in marketing. So how did your journey actually bring you to writing? Have you always wanted to write? Have you written before? What prompted you to actually sit down, write, and get 2 books published?
So with my start, I knew I wanted to be a humor writer from an early age. I was one of those kids that would watch Saturday Night Live and recite word for word the skits and sketches and bits from there. And at some point after college, I knew I wanted to move into that, because what happens after college is you kind of get swept up into how are you going to have a job, make money, get insurance, that sort of thing. So you become a real life adult. And I knew that I wanted to do humor writing, but wasn't sure what that meant. It's not like I had friends who did it. It's not like my parents encouraged me to do it. So I needed to figure it out myself. And back then, I don't know if when you did Google, you really got all the best results. So the way I ended up, sort of where I ended up, was I knew I wanted to do comedy, write humorous stories or write comedy, but I didn't know what that would entail. So I Googled Korean Korean comedy writer, and I was like, oh, maybe I'll just talk to somebody that has done it before. And the first listing was a Korean American female comic in New York, where I was living at the time. So I set up a meeting and took her out for drinks and talked about what she did. And it turned out that she actually wasn't a writer in the traditional sense. She wrote jokes. And then I said, well, it says you're an actor or a performer. And she said, oh, I perform my jokes. It also says you're a stand-up comic. Oh, that I do. I actually perform and do stand-up, on stage. So everything led back to her joke writing, and everything led back to her stand-up. I was really confused at the time. But she had a set that she was going to do that night, so I watched her. And then she had just basically told these jokes about her growing up as a Korean American in Seattle. And I remember the crowd laughing at times that were appropriate, and I thought that her humor was very relatable to me. And then I realized that maybe people would find these stories interesting or funny. These types of stories of being kind of a fish out of water, a Korean American girl. For me, my perspective, I was from Tennessee, and there's a whole lot of funny things that can come out of being a Korean in the South. So I decided that was going to be something I would try out. And pretty early on, when I did my first show and performed in front of people, I took to it right away, and I was lucky to have gotten a positive reception. And I think I just stayed with it because it was something I knew how to do, and I was getting better at it, and my joke writing was getting more refined. And I was able to tell my own stories from my perspective, and do it in front of an audience. But then I think after doing it for so long, I realized that this actually wasn't what I was starting out intending to do, that I actually wanted to be a humor writer not a performer. So it just wasn't performing was never really something I'd ever really thought to do or wanted to do. A lot of people that do stand-up end up wanting to be on TV or in movies, and I just like the idea of seeing like close-ups of my face, on the screen was not what I really ever wanted in life. So I ended up taking writing classes that, again, didn't have to do with novel writing. It was like humor writing at NYU Extension. Then when I moved to Seattle, I took humorous personal essays with, some, and I forgot the instructor's name, but I've blanked out on him. He's Dan Savage. He was a columnist that I really found hilarious. And so just for him to teach that class and for me to be in it, I knew I'd learn a lot, and I did. He taught me a lot about just writing from your point of view. And then life passed, and then I finally decided that maybe fiction was something that I wanted to try out. And then that's how I ended up kind of where I am now. Is I was wanting to be a storyteller or a humor writer, and I finally figured out that writing fiction was a way to do it, where I could still tell stories from a Korean American's perspective and from my own point of view, but also do it in a way that could actually be something that I could see myself doing for the long term.
Thank you for that. When you take the time to read, what genres and authors do you generally gravitate towards?
Oh, wow. So I read pretty broadly, actually. If you looked at my bookshelf, you'd be pretty surprised by the variety in the books, because I read nonfiction, sometimes for my writing, but also just recommendations from friends. And then again, humor. There's also when I'm writing, I don't necessarily like to read a lot of rom-coms, only because I'm already writing it and I want something different when I'm reading, to just break it up a little bit and just in mind share. So I think when I'm writing, I tend to gravitate toward thrillers and suspense. And so some of the writers that I've really taken to are Kathleen Barber, who I think she has 2 books out now. They're both suspensey, thrillery books. And Jocelyn Jackson, I finished her Never Have I Ever, and it was just a page turner. And I just really like her storytelling. And then one of my most recent books that, not recent to me because I read so slowly, but one of my recent books was Pachinko, and I just talk about that book all the time to people. That, again, has nothing to do with what I write, but I just loved her storytelling and her accessible writing, but it's historical fiction and multi-generational, and it's just something that I wasn't necessarily looking to read, but I had a friend that said, I think you'd like this book, and then I tried it out, and it was just exactly what I needed to read back then. So yeah, I guess in the end I end up reading rom-coms very sparingly because I'm always ending up being on deadline. But therefore when I'm on deadline, I end up reading thrillers. And suspense. So if you have any recommendations, definitely send them my way.
Well, Kathleen has actually been on the podcast. And while you were sleeping I can't talk. See, okay. Kathleen has been on the podcast, and she is I enjoyed her very much, and I enjoyed her book. So that's very cool.
Yes. I really like her writing as well. She's she wrote one recently called Follow Me, and it's just really made me want to cover my video camera and just make sure everything is unplugged. And I think a little bit extra about your security of your own technology. She impacted my life both in a reading sense and also just rethinking kind of my own habits.
I have not read that one yet. I'm looking forward to it. So we have talked about quite a few different things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to mention now?
The only thing I would say is something I just want to add is that for writers, sometimes it's very hard to write in a formulaic way. There's tropes and then there's certain types of structure that you need to follow, but if your book blends genres, and in mine kind of are a blend of, because there's no rom-com category, it would be considered women's fiction / romance / humor. It doesn't quite fit in a box, and I think there are other writers like that, and I wish publishing had a little bit more flexibility in how they marketed and position books, such that it's very clear to somebody that's reading a book or picking it up, which types of categories it might blend into. Again, my books are about they're like nerdy coming of age stories where the person falls in love. And that's really hard to market, or say, and still fit in, this is clearly the Nora Roberts category, or this is clearly the, Jennifer Weiner category. So it's hard to be an author if you have a lot of ideas that you want to try out and be creative, while still trying to think about now, once you're already on contract, or you know what the market is looking for, to have this creativity where you can actually go outside of those bounds and feel comfortable with doing that, because that certain stories would be better or more enhanced or more interesting if they had a way to kind of cross over into a different category. And it might make a better story, but it might make it harder for a team to market.
Yep, you are not the only author that has this issue. I think it definitely needs to be rethought somehow.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then, it is true. And then especially for authors of color that have characters that have journeys that might be different than how, say, a typical white protagonist might, the journey that they might be on. There's nuance to that journey that isn't something that just comes out easily in marketing copy, or in a summary or synopsis. There's parts to a story, especially when a person faces microaggressions in the workplace, or on the street, or within their family. There's stereotypes and bias and things that come out because of somebody's just how they're brought up. And again, these things are not easily described and thought of as themes, but they are parts of books that are important. And it's just not something that people always, when they read the book, they're sometimes surprised by the things that are in the book, and they shouldn't be. There should be a way to convey the things that are included in a book that consumers and readers, they will be able to see it and know that this is part of this person's journey.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Suzanne, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me today about not only one, but 2 books. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
It's been fun.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a really great experience. I appreciate it.
Thank you once again to Suzanne for joining me for this interview and talking about her 2 new novels. I grew up in the era of romantic comedies. Romantic comedy movies aren't as popular as they used to be, but I grew up in a time when there were lots of romantic comedies, and I grew up watching them, and I still quote them with my sister. And these 2 books reminded me a lot of those. I suppose they'd probably be classics now. I don't even like to think about that. But classics like When Harry Met Sally and French Kiss and lots of others that I'm blanking on the names of right now, because had I not brought this topic up, I would have been able to give you lots more names of romantic comedies that I grew up with, end quote. But just, that meet cute, that story of conflict and silly arguments and but serious issues underlying the themes as well. I loved those movies. I love those movies. I will still watch them. And these 2 books reminded me of that genre of movies. And so I liked both books. They were fun. They are fun. They are funny, and they still address issues that come up in relationships and in life, especially in these 2 with multicultural relationships and familial obligations, etc. So thank you to Suzanne once again for joining me. Thank you, as always, for joining me. If you are a fan of this podcast, please remember to leave us a nice review, whether that is written or 5 stars. That really, really helps us out, and I am so appreciative of anyone who leaves a review. Also, follow us on social media. Follow me. It's not really us. It's me and the authors. Let's go with that. Follow the podcast on social media, GSMC Book Review, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. In the meantime, I hope that you are having a wonderful day. I hope your week involves plenty of time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.